My boss fired me after 12 years and laughed. "You're a loser!" But 3 days later, a lawyer called me. "Miss, the owner of the company passed away and left it all to you." When I walked into the office as the new owner, the room went silent. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I had spent 12 years of my life inside the same building on Meridian Avenue, and for a long time, I told myself that was something to be proud of. My name is Claire Whitfield. I was 41 years old, divorced, no children, a fact my mother reminded me of every Thanksgiving with the practiced sadness of someone who had rehearsed it for years. I drove a sensible gray Honda, kept a small apartment in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, and arrived at Hargrove and Associates every morning at 7:58, 2 minutes before the official start of the day. I was the senior operations coordinator. I handled vendor contracts, internal compliance, payroll processing for 3 regional branches, and I trained every new hire who walked through the door. I was, by every practical measure, the spine of that office. But spines don't get credit. Tables do. Chairs do. Anything visible gets the credit. Hargrove and Associates was a mid-sized logistics consulting firm. It had been built from nothing by a man named Gerald Hargrove, who was 73 years old, rarely came into the office anymore, and had a habit of sending handwritten notes through his personal assistant instead of emails. I had met Gerald perhaps a dozen times over the years. He was a quiet man, formal in the way that men of his generation often are. But his eyes were attentive, and whenever we spoke, he asked questions that told me he had actually read whatever report I had sent him. I respected him without knowing him well. That is, I think, its own kind of respect. The man I knew far better, too well, in fact, was my direct supervisor. His name was Derek Paulson. He had joined the company 6 years ago with a business degree, a firm handshake, and an ability to take credit for other people's work that was so smooth it almost looked like a talent. Derek was 44, broad-shouldered, chronically optimistic in meetings, and quietly vicious in private. He had the kind of confidence that comes not from competence, but from never having been genuinely challenged. In the beginning, I hadn't minded him. That was my first mistake. The first warning sign came 18 months before everything fell apart. We had just finished a major contract renegotiation with a freight company out of Indianapolis, a process I had led almost entirely on my own, preparing the data, running the projections, coordinating the calls. When the director of operations sent a company-wide congratulations email, it mentioned Derek by name, twice. It mentioned me once in a subordinate clause, as part of Derek's team. I remember reading that email at my desk and feeling something cold move through me. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter, a recognition. I told myself it was an oversight. The second sign came 4 months later, when Derek began scheduling one-on-one meetings with Gerald's assistant, a woman named Patricia, who relayed everything back to Gerald. I noticed because Patricia started asking me questions she'd never asked before. Small questions about processes, about timelines, about how certain decisions had been made. Questions that told me someone had been presenting those processes as his own. I said nothing. I documented everything in a private folder on my personal laptop, dated and time-stamped, the way you do when you're not sure yet whether you're being paranoid or perceptive. By the time I understood the difference, it was too late to stop what was coming. It was a Tuesday in March, the kind of gray, damp morning that Ohio specializes in. I was called into Derek's office at 10:15. I assumed it was the quarterly review. I had prepared for it, had my notes, had 3 proposals I'd been developing for months. I was not prepared for what actually happened. Derek was sitting behind his desk. His expression was the one I had come to recognize as performance. Practice sympathy layered over something harder. He did not ask me to sit down. "Claire," he said, "I need to let you know that your position is being eliminated. Today is your last day." I remember the silence that followed, the hum of the ventilation system, the faint sound of someone laughing in the hallway. 12 years, I said. He shrugged. Actually shrugged. "The company is restructuring. It's nothing personal." I stood there, and I don't know what he saw on my face in that moment, but whatever it was made something flicker in his eyes. And then he smiled. Not the professional, regretful smile of a manager delivering difficult news. A real smile, one that reached his eyes. "You gave it a good run, though," he said. And then, "I still cannot fully believe this happened," he laughed. A small, dismissive sound. "You were never really built for this level, Claire. Some people just aren't." He called me a loser without using the word. He didn't need to. I picked up my bag. I walked out of his office. I walked past my desk, past 12 years of carefully organized files, past the coffee machine I had stocked every Monday morning, past Patricia, who looked at me with something that might have been guilt, and I walked out the front door of Hargrove and Associates into the cold March air. I sat in my gray Honda for 11 minutes before I started the engine. I did not cry. I made a list. The list I made in that parking lot was not strategic. Not yet. It was just the kind of list you make when your mind needs something to hold on to, when the alternative is to sit with the full weight of what just happened and you're not ready for that yet. Things I needed to do. Call my landlord about the rent due in 11 days. Figure out how long my savings would last. Find my insurance card. Remember whether Ohio required a waiting period before unemployment benefits kicked in. I drove home on autopilot. The streets of Columbus were ordinary and indifferent in the way streets always are when your life has just been restructured without your consent. I passed the dry cleaner where I dropped off my blazers every other week, the gas station where I always paid at the pump because I hated going inside, the Walgreens where I bought the same brand of coffee pods in bulk, all of it still there, none of it caring. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I pulled up my bank accounts. The numbers were not catastrophic, but they were not comfortable either. I had 4 months of savings if I was careful, 3 if I wasn't. I had no severance. Derek had handed me a single envelope on the way out, which I had not opened until now. Inside was a termination letter dated 2 weeks prior, a Cobra health insurance continuation notice, and a non-disclosure agreement asking me to waive any claims against the company in exchange for 1 month's salary. 1 month. After 12 years. I put the NDA back in the envelope. I did not sign it. That was the first real decision I made. I spent that first night doing what I suspect many people do after an unexpected blow, oscillating between disbelief and grim calculation. By 2 a.m, I had gone through my employment contract, my performance reviews, all of which were strong, documented, signed, and the employee handbook I had actually helped update 3 years ago. I knew Ohio labor law better than most people realized because part of my job had involved compliance. I knew that eliminating a position while immediately filling it with different personnel was legally significant. I knew that a pattern of credit appropriation, if documented, could support a case. I had a private folder on my laptop with 18 months of documentation. What had felt like paranoia now felt like foresight. Still, and I want to be honest about this, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. I was afraid. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a crisis, but the slow, settling fear of someone who has just realized how much of their identity was tied to a place they no longer have access to. I was 41 years old. I had poured 12 years into a company I did not own and had been laughed out of it by a man who had been there for 6. What does that make you? I let myself feel that for exactly one day. I canceled my plans for that Wednesday, ate cereal for dinner, watched 3 episodes of a procedural drama I had seen before and didn't care about, and went to bed at 9 o'clock. On Thursday morning, I woke up at 6. I showered. I made real coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and I began to think clearly. The first thing I wrote down was, what do I actually know? I knew Derek had been systematically presenting my work as his own to Gerald Hargrove's inner circle. I had documentation of specific instances, emails I had sent that were later summarized in his name, reports with my formatting and analysis that appeared in his presentations, timeline discrepancies that showed his contributions post-dated mine by days or weeks. I knew the termination was suspicious in its timing. I had just completed the most complex contract renegotiation in the company's recent history. Eliminating my position the moment the project was closed was too convenient. I knew I had not signed the NDA. The second thing I wrote down was, who can help me? I thought about this carefully. I didn't have money for a protracted legal battle. I wasn't sure I had a case. Not yet, not without knowing more. What I needed first was information, and information required access. The third thing I wrote down was a name. Patricia. Patricia had worked for Gerald Hargrove for 19 years. She was 61, deeply private, and had always treated me with the particular respect that administrative professionals reserve for other people who actually do the work. We were not close friends, but we had eaten lunch together on perhaps 30 occasions over the years, and she had never once said anything careless or disloyal. She had also looked at me with something like guilt when I walked out on Tuesday. I didn't know what she knew, but I believed she knew something. My plan at this stage was modest and specific. I would call Patricia. I would not accuse or demand. I would ask, I would listen, and I would find out whether what I suspected was only the surface of something much deeper. I also decided, before I made any move, to consult an employment attorney. Not to file anything, not yet, but to understand my position, to know what I was holding before I played any cards. I picked up my phone. I searched for employment attorneys in Columbus with experience in wrongful termination. I found a woman named Sandra Okafor, whose reviews described her as someone who did not waste your time. I left a voicemail. Then I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring, and when I said my name, there was a pause that told me everything. "Claire," she said carefully, "I was wondering if you'd call." We agreed to meet for coffee on Saturday morning at a cafe near Patricia's neighborhood, far enough from Meridian Avenue that the chances of running into anyone from the office were negligible. I spent Friday preparing. I printed my documentation, organized it chronologically in a manila folder, and wrote a 2-page summary that laid out what I knew, what I suspected, and what I could prove. Years of operations work had made me precise. If I was going to make any kind of case, legal or otherwise, I needed to be a reliable narrator of my own experience. Sandra Okafor called me back Friday afternoon. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, and she could see me Monday at 11. "Bring everything," she said. Performance reviews, the termination letter, any communication you've kept. Don't sign anything in the meantime." "I haven't," I told her. "Good," she said, in a tone that suggested this was less common than it should be. Saturday morning was cold and bright. Patricia was already at the cafe when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. She looked smaller outside the office, in civilian clothes, without the structure of her professional role around her. She looked tired. I sat down. I ordered coffee. I did not begin with my folder or my questions. I began by saying, "I know this is uncomfortable for you. I'm not here to put you in a position. I just want to understand what happened." Patricia looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at me. "Gerald has been sick," she said, "for about 8 months. It started as a cardiac issue, and then it became more complicated. He hasn't told anyone in the company, not officially. He didn't want it affecting business relationships or investor confidence." I absorbed this slowly. How serious? Serious enough that he's been working on his affairs. She paused. Personal affairs. I didn't push. I let the silence do what silences do. "Derek approached Gerald's inner circle about a year ago," Patricia continued, her voice low and measured. "He presented himself as the natural successor, said he had rebuilt the operations infrastructure, that he had transformed the department. He had documents, presentations, with my work in them." She met my eyes. Yes. There it was, not a suspicion, a confirmation from someone who had been in the room. "Patricia," I said, "did Gerald believe him?" She was quiet for a long moment. "At first, but Gerald is not a careless man. He started asking me questions about the renegotiation, about specific decisions. When I answered honestly," she stopped. "I think he was starting to understand that the picture Derek had painted didn't match the one I was describing. And then I was fired. 2 days after Gerald asked me those questions. The timing sat between us like something solid. I did not ask Patricia to do anything. I did not ask her to testify or to write anything down or to put herself at risk. I thanked her for meeting me. I paid for both coffees, and I walked back to my car in the cold morning air with the kind of clarity that only comes when something you feared is confirmed, but the confirmation gives you something to work with. On Monday, I sat across from Sandra Okafor in her downtown office. She was in her mid-50s, methodical, with reading glasses she pushed up her nose when she was concentrating. She went through my folder in silence for 20 minutes while I drank the coffee her assistant had brought. "Okay," she said finally. "Tell me about the NDA." I explained. She nodded. "They offered you 1 month's salary to waive all claims. You didn't sign. That was the right call." She set down a performance review from 2 years ago. Rated exceeds expectations in every category, signed by Derek himself. This alone is going to make the position elimination story complicated for them. Is there a case? Potentially a strong one. Wrongful termination, possibly retaliation, especially with the timing Patricia described. I'd wanted to pose Patricia formally, but if she's willing to give a statement, that changes things significantly. She removed her glasses. "Here's what I want you to understand. This could be a civil matter. It could result in significant compensation. But I also want to know if there's anything else going on at that company. Because if Derek Paulson was fraudulently misrepresenting authorship to influence succession decisions, that's not just an HR issue." I told her about Gerald being ill, about the succession. Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Do you know if Gerald has an attorney?" I said I didn't. "Find out," she said. I already knew who to ask. What I didn't know yet was that Derek had not been idle. While I had been making coffee on Thursday morning and writing my lists, he had been watching. Someone, I would find out later it was a junior coordinator named Ryan who owed Derek a series of small professional favors, had seen me having coffee with Patricia on Saturday and had mentioned it to Derek by Sunday evening. On Monday, while I was sitting in Sandra's office, Derek was making phone calls of his own. Sandra moved efficiently. By the end of the first week, she had filed a formal inquiry with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission based on the pattern of credit misappropriation and the suspicious timing of my termination. She was careful. She did not overpromise, and she explained every step before taking it. She also put me in contact with a colleague of hers, an estates and probate attorney named Marcus Webb, who had experience with corporate succession matters. I did not yet know if Gerald's situation intersected with my own, but Sandra believed in covering the terrain before you needed it. I, meanwhile, had reached out to Patricia again, gently, without pressure, to ask whether she might be willing to provide a formal statement. She asked for 3 days to think about it. I gave her 5. I spent those days doing what I had always done best, gathering information precisely and without emotion. I reconstructed a timeline going back 2 years, mapping every major deliverable I had produced against Derek's subsequent presentations to senior leadership. The pattern was damning in its consistency. He hadn't just taken credit occasionally, he had built an entire professional reputation on a foundation of my work. I also began quietly reaching out to 2 former colleagues who had left Hargrove and Associates within the past 18 months. One of them, a woman named Deborah Chen, who now worked for a competitor in Cincinnati, responded immediately. "I left because of him," she wrote back. "I've been wondering if anyone would ever do something about it." She agreed to provide a written account. Things were moving. Carefully, but moving. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. The voice was Derek's. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know you've been talking to Sandra Okafor," he said. "I know you met with Patricia. I want to give you the opportunity to walk away from this before it becomes something that damages you permanently." I sat very still in my kitchen. I did not say anything for several seconds, which I think unsettled him, because he continued before I responded. "You signed a non-disclosure." "I didn't sign it," I said quietly. "Read the envelope." It came back blank. A pause. Shorter than I would have expected. He recovered quickly. That was one thing I had always credited him with. "Claire, listen to me. You're a 41-year-old woman with no job and no connections in this industry who is about to take on a company with corporate legal counsel. Think about what that looks like. Think about how long it takes. Think about your savings." Another pause, more deliberate this time. "I can make a call. I know 3 firms in Columbus that are hiring at your level. 1 reference from me and you're employed by next month. No lawsuit, no ugliness, no public record of a dispute. Just move on." It was, I will admit, a well-constructed offer. It addressed the exact fears he assumed I had: employment, money, time, dignity. "Derek," I said, "I'd like to make sure I understand you correctly. Are you offering me a job referral in exchange for dropping my legal inquiry?" He went very quiet. "Because that's called witness tampering," I said, "and I'm going to ask you not to call this number again." I hung up. My hands were steady. I was genuinely surprised by this. 20 minutes later, my email pinged. It was from Hargrove and Associates' corporate legal team, a cease and desist letter asserting that my communications with Patricia constituted tortious interference with an employee relationship and demanding I provide a list of all parties I had contacted regarding my employment. The letter was aggressive, dense with legal language, and clearly designed to frighten. I forwarded it to Sandra within the hour. Her response came back in 40 minutes. "This is a scare tactic. It has no legal merit in this context. Do not respond directly. I'll handle it." And she did. Sandra sent a formal response the following morning that was 11 paragraphs long and referenced 4 specific Ohio statutes. I read it twice. It was like watching someone dismantle a bluff with a scalpel. 2 days later, the corporate legal team went quiet. The following Monday, Patricia Ung submitted a formal written statement to Sandra's office. 4 pages, single-spaced, specific and detailed. She had decided, she told me later in a text message, that she had worked for Gerald Hargrove for 19 years, and that meant something. It meant she owed him an honest accounting of what had happened in his name. I stared at that text message for a long time. After 10 days of sustained effort, emotional, strategic, legal, I gave myself 3 days. I drove to a state park 2 hours south of Columbus. I rented a small cabin. I brought books I had been meaning to read for 2 years, cooking supplies for simple meals, and a notebook that I did not use for lists or timelines. I walked trails in the early morning when the air was still cold enough to see my breath. I ate dinner slowly without looking at my phone. I let myself remember who I was before I had been defined by my usefulness to other people. I came back on a Thursday, rested in the specific way you can only rest when you have stopped pretending that exhaustion is a virtue. My phone contained 3 messages I hadn't seen, one from Sandra, one from Marcus Webb, and one from a number I didn't recognize with a Columbus area code. I called Sandra first. "Gerald Hargrove passed away 5 days ago," she said. "Marcus has been trying to reach you. Claire, you need to call him today." Marcus Webb's office was on the east side of the city, in a quieter part of downtown where the buildings were older and the parking was easier. He was a compact, deliberate man in his early 60s who spoke the way people do when they have spent decades in rooms where the wrong word costs someone everything. He did not offer me condolences about Gerald Hargrove. He seemed to understand instinctively that I had not known the man well enough for condolences to be the right register. What he offered instead was information, delivered plainly. Gerald Hargrove had updated his will 7 weeks ago. In it, he left the majority of his estate, including his controlling interest in Hargrove and Associates, to me. I sat across from Marcus Webb in a leather chair that was older than most of my furniture, and I tried to keep my expression neutral while my internal architecture quietly collapsed and rebuilt itself. "Why?" I said. The word came out simpler than I intended. Marcus chose his words carefully. From what I understand, and I only know what Gerald communicated to me directly, he had been reconsidering a number of things over the past several months. He described you as someone who had been, in his words, systematically misrepresented to him. He said he had come to understand, somewhat late, that the competence he had credited to Derek Paulson had not been Paulson's to claim. Marcus paused. He also said that anyone who kept documentation and didn't sign an NDA probably had a clearer sense of her own value than most. I was quiet for a moment. "Gerald knew," I said. "Gerald figured it out," Marcus corrected gently. "There's a difference." There were, of course, legal complexities. A will can be contested. Derek, as the presumptive operational heir in his own mind, would almost certainly challenge this, and corporate succession was never simple. Marcus laid it all out methodically. The probate process, the likely timeline, the possibility of a board challenge. He also told me that Gerald had been specific and thorough in his documentation, that the will had been drawn up with considerable care, and that the legal foundation was solid. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "Right now? Nothing. Let the process begin. The will enters probate. The board is notified. You'll need to be present for certain hearings. In the meantime," he looked at me over his glasses, "try not to make any public statements." I told him I was good at that. I drove home slowly, taking the long route that went through the older neighborhoods, past the kind of houses that have been in families for generations, with front porches and mature trees, and the particular settled look of things that have lasted. I was trying to locate myself in what had just happened. 12 years of work, a man I had respected from a distance, a decision he had made in the last months of his life to correct something. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like something more complicated, like being handed a torch by someone who was no longer there to carry it. By that evening, Derek knew. I don't know exactly how the information traveled. Wills are nominally private during probate, but in a company of that size, with the board being notified, discretion has limits. My phone began receiving calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I let them go to voicemail. One of them was Derek himself, not threatening this time. Something worse. Conciliatory. "Claire," his voicemail said, the performance of warmth almost convincing, "I know this situation has become complicated. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding between us, and I'd love the chance to sit down, have a real conversation, clear the air. I think we both want what's best for the company." A pause. Gerald would have wanted that too. The invocation of Gerald's name after working to deceive Gerald for 2 years was, I thought, a particular kind of audacity. I did not return the call. What I did instead was call my sister, Renee, who lived in Portland and who had the rare ability to listen without offering unsolicited advice. I told her everything, all of it. The firing, the documentation, the attorney, Patricia's statement, Gerald's will. Renee listened for 40 minutes without interrupting, which for Renee was a significant act of restraint. When I finished, she said, "Do you know what you're doing?" "I think so," I said. "Then do it," she said, "and stop apologizing for being the person in the room who actually did the work." I also called Deborah Chen, my former colleague in Cincinnati, not for professional reasons this time, just to talk to someone who had been in similar territory and had come out the other side. She was warm and direct, and she told me things she had never told anyone inside Hargrove and Associates. We stayed on the phone for 2 hours. At the end, she said she would come to Columbus if I needed her there in person. I told her I would keep that offer. Through all of this, I noticed something about my own emotional state that surprised me. The fear that had been present in the first days after the firing, the cold, stomach-dropping fear of financial precarity and professional erasure, had not disappeared, but it had changed in quality. It had become something drier, more functional, the kind of steady unease that keeps your judgment sharp rather than clouding it. Derek was watching me. I knew that. He was waiting to see if the weight of it would make me flinch, make some impulsive move he could use. He assumed, because he had always assumed it, that pressure was a more powerful tool against me than it was against him. He had miscalculated that before. He was doing it again. He came in person on a Tuesday. I hadn't expected that. The phone calls, the voicemails, the email through corporate counsel. Those were all predictable moves, pressure applied at a safe distance. But Derek Paulson showing up at the door of my apartment building at 11 in the morning was something else. It meant the distance had stopped feeling safe to him. I let him in because I wanted to see him, because sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is let your opponent play their hand in full view. He was wearing a suit, not his usual office look, more deliberate than that. A dark jacket, a white shirt, no tie. The visual vocabulary of someone who wants to be taken seriously without appearing aggressive. He had also brought coffee, 2 cups from the cafe 3 blocks away that he had no way of knowing I liked, which meant someone had done reconnaissance. "I appreciate you seeing me," he said, sitting down at my kitchen table, as if he'd been invited to do so. I sat across from him. I had not offered him anything. I waited. "I want to be honest with you," he began, which is almost always the first sentence of someone who intends to be something other than honest. "I think this situation has gotten out of hand, and I take some responsibility for that. The way things ended, it wasn't handled well. I should have been more careful with your transition." My transition. As if my firing had been a logistical inconvenience we shared. "I hear you," I said. I gave him nothing else. He continued. He was good at this. The gradual escalation of apparent sincerity, the careful pivot from apology toward negotiation. He said that the board was nervous, that a succession dispute was bad for everyone, employees, clients, investors, that Gerald, for all his wisdom, had made a decision in declining health that deserved scrutiny. He said the word scrutiny softly, as if it were reasonable rather than a threat. "There are people on the board," he said, "who are questioning the circumstances of the will, Gerald's mental capacity in his final months, the influence of outside parties." He let that land. I'm not saying I share those concerns. I'm saying they exist and they will be raised, and that process will be long and costly and public. He looked at me steadily. "I want to offer you an alternative." He pushed a folded piece of paper across the table. I didn't touch it. "It's a settlement offer," he said, "a very generous one, a significant financial package, a strong professional reference, and a clean exit from the legal proceedings. You would walk away comfortable. No protracted court battle, no deposition, no having your career examined line by line in probate hearings." I looked at the paper. I looked at him. "Derek," I said, "walk me through what you're actually offering." He blinked, slightly thrown by the directness. "I'm offering you a way to avoid—" "You're offering me money to disappear before the probate process validates the will," I said. "You're hoping that if I settle the civil case and walk away from the succession, the board challenge has more room to succeed. You're also implying, carefully without quite saying it, that the board might raise questions about Gerald's mental state that could damage the will's validity. That's not a settlement. That's a coordinated maneuver." He stared at me. The performance of warmth was gone. What replaced it was what had always been underneath it, cold calculation assessing a variable that was no longer behaving as expected. "You're making a mistake," he said. His voice was different now, flatter. "I've made mistakes," I told him. "Signing that NDA would have been one. This isn't." He stood. He retrieved the folded paper from the table without being invited to. He straightened his jacket with the deliberate care of someone reassembling their composure. "The board hearing is in 6 weeks," he said. "Make sure you have good legal representation." It was not advice. It was a statement of intent. Then he left. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after the door closed. I will not pretend the conversation left me unmoved. There was fear, real, present, specific fear. 6 weeks, a board challenge, expensive proceedings, the possibility that Gerald's will could be contested on grounds of mental incapacity, a charge that was hard to disprove when the subject could no longer speak for himself. But here is what I also knew. Derek had come in person because the phone calls hadn't worked. He had built an elaborate structure of professional deception over 6 years, and now that structure was under examination, and he was frightened. Not of me specifically, of documentation, of Patricia's statement, of Deborah Chen's account, of a 41-year-old woman who had spent 18 months keeping careful records because she had trusted her own perception. The fear I felt that afternoon was real, but it did not tell me to stop. It told me to make sure my foundation was solid before the storm hit. I called Sandra within the hour and told her about the visit. I described the settlement offer and the implied threat regarding Gerald's mental state. "Document the visit," she said immediately. "Date, time, what he said, verbatim as much as possible. Then send it to me in writing tonight." I did. And I also called Marcus Webb, because if Gerald's mental capacity was going to be contested, that meant we needed Gerald's medical records, his attorney-client communications, his personal correspondence, everything that demonstrated a man making deliberate, considered decisions rather than the confused choices of someone diminished by illness. What I didn't know yet was that Gerald had anticipated this. Almost exactly this. The board hearing was held in the conference room on the 4th floor of Hargrove and Associates, the same building on Meridian Avenue where I had spent 12 years. I arrived 12 minutes early. I wore a charcoal blazer and carried the same leather portfolio I had used for every major presentation I had ever given in that building. Sandra walked in beside me. Marcus Webb was already in the room, seated at the far end of the table. There were 7 board members. 3 of them I recognized. 2 had been with the company for years and had always been cordial to me in the procedural way that senior leadership is cordial to competent staff they've never quite seen. The 3rd, a man named Harlan Coates, had always struck me as someone who made decisions based on whoever was in front of him most recently. Derek was there. He was seated to the left of Harlan Coates, which told me something about where the alliances had been built. He had 2 attorneys with him, both in expensive suits, both conveying the kind of confidence that comes from billing at a high hourly rate. When I sat down, Derek looked at me. I looked back. Neither of us smiled. The hearing began formally. The board chair, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, who I had met perhaps twice, opened by explaining the purpose of the session, to evaluate the validity of Gerald Hargrove's final will and testament, and to assess the appropriate succession path for the company's leadership. She was precise and showed no preference, which I appreciated. Derek's attorneys went first. They had built a case around 3 claims. First, that Gerald Hargrove had been suffering from significant cognitive decline in the months before his death, citing a single medical opinion from a physician I had never heard of. Second, that the will reflected an improper personal relationship between Gerald and myself, a claim so constructed that it almost required admiration for its audacity. Third, that as the acting operational head, Derek Paulson was the natural and appropriate steward of the company's interests. They spoke for 40 minutes. They were polished. They presented charts. They used the phrase, "the integrity of the company," 7 times. I counted. When they finished, Sandra stood. She began with Gerald's own documentation, a set of letters he had written to Marcus Webb over a period of 3 months, dictated and then reviewed and signed in Gerald's own hand, which were clear, specific, and legally precise. The letters described his reasoning. They described what he had learned. They described, in Gerald's formal, careful prose, how he had come to understand that the operational competence that had defined his company for 12 years had resided not in the person who claimed it, but in the person who had produced it. Sandra then presented the second piece of evidence, the report from Gerald's primary cardiologist and his neurologist, both of whom had provided affidavits confirming that while Gerald had experienced cardiac complications, his cognitive function had tested normal at every evaluation, including one conducted 4 days before the will was signed. The physician Derek's attorneys had cited, it emerged, had met Gerald once, briefly in a social context, and had no formal basis for a clinical opinion. The board shifted in their chairs. Sandra continued. She presented my performance reviews. She presented the timeline I had constructed, 18 months of documented evidence showing the systematic transference of my work to Derek's professional identity. She presented Patricia's written statement, and then she called Patricia into the room because Patricia had agreed to appear in person. Patricia Ung walked in with the composure of someone who has spent 19 years managing a powerful man's affairs and knows exactly how to enter a room. She sat down. She answered questions clearly, specifically, and without hesitation. She described in precise detail the meetings she had witnessed, the questions Gerald had asked her, the answers she had given, and the timeline of Gerald's evolving understanding of what had been done in his name. When Derek's attorney attempted to suggest that Patricia was acting out of personal loyalty to me rather than factual accuracy, Patricia looked at him with an expression of mild professional disdain. "I'm acting," she said quietly, "out of 19 years of loyalty to Gerald Hargrove, which is why I'm here." Then Sandra presented the third piece of evidence. This was the one I hadn't known about until 48 hours before the hearing. Marcus Webb had found it in Gerald's files, a personal memo written in Gerald's hand, dated 9 weeks before his death. It was addressed to no one in particular, the kind of document a careful man writes for himself to clarify his own thinking. In it, Gerald described discovering the pattern of misattribution. He described the specific moment, a conversation with Patricia that had made something click into place. He described his anger, and he described his decision. The company bears my name. I intend it to be carried by someone who has genuinely earned it. The room was very quiet when Sandra finished reading that sentence. I looked at Derek. He was looking at the table. One of his attorneys leaned toward him and said something quietly. Derek gave a small, sharp shake of his head. His jaw was tight. The smooth professional armor he had worn into this room was cracked in a way that I suspected he did not know how to repair. Eleanor Marsh asked if the opposing counsel had any response to the documentation presented. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 15 seconds. "We'd like to request a recess," one of Derek's attorneys said. They did not come back from the recess with a counter-argument. They came back with a request to withdraw the challenge. The withdrawal of Derek's challenge was not a quiet procedural note. It was the sound of a structure collapsing under its own weight. Eleanor Marsh accepted the withdrawal formally, and the board voted, 5-2, with Harlan Coates ultimately voting in favor of the will's validity, which I suspected had something to do with the speed with which he reassessed his position the moment Derek's attorneys stopped projecting confidence. The will was confirmed. I was the majority owner of Hargrove and Associates. There are moments in life that you have imagined so abstractly that when they arrive in concrete form, they feel almost documentary, as though you are watching yourself from a small distance. This was one of those moments. I sat in that conference room on Meridian Avenue and felt the weight of it settle around me, not triumphant and electric the way films suggest, but steady and factual. Real. Mine. Sandra filed the finalized employment discrimination claims separately. Derek's personal attorneys, distinct from the corporate counsel who'd quietly distanced themselves once the board vote was clear, advised him to settle. He did. The settlement covered 2 years of lost salary, damages, and legal fees. I did not celebrate that number. I noted it, signed the paperwork that Sandra had reviewed word by word, and moved on. Derek's tenure at the company ended the same week. He resigned rather than wait to be terminated, which I had expected. Men like Derek tend to frame their retreats as choices. The letter he sent to the board described a desire to pursue new opportunities, language so divorced from what had actually occurred that it briefly seemed like satire. I did not write a response. I had Sandra acknowledge receipt through the proper channels. The morning I returned to the building on Meridian Avenue as its owner, I arrived at 7:58, the same time I had always arrived. Whether that was habit or statement, I'm not entirely sure, but it felt right. I took the elevator to the 4th floor, walked into the conference room where the board hearing had been held, and met with Eleanor Marsh and the remaining board members for the first time in my new capacity. Eleanor was professional and straightforward. She'd voted in favor of the will, I learned, from the first moment, because she had worked with Gerald long enough to recognize when he had made a considered decision. She was also, it became clear quickly, a genuinely useful operational mind, and I decided within the first 20 minutes that I wanted her perspective on the structural decisions ahead. After the board meeting, I walked through the office. I want to be precise about what this was. It was not a procession. I did not make an announcement or call everyone together. I simply walked through the space I knew as well as I knew my own apartment. Past the operations floor, past the coordinator stations, past the coffee machine I had stocked every Monday morning for 12 years. People looked up, and the room did go quiet. Not dramatically, not in the way that would make a good scene in a film, but in the way that happens when a space recalibrates. When people who thought they understood the hierarchy discover that the map was wrong. A few people nodded. A few looked away. One young coordinator, a woman who had joined 6 months ago and whom I had briefly trained, said, "Good morning," in a voice that was both ordinary and significant. "Good morning," I said back. I took Gerald's office at the end of the hall. Not immediately, not that day. I spent a week in a transitional space working through the operational assessment, the financial review, the staffing evaluation. But when I moved in, I kept the office largely as it was. I added my own desk chair, a plant, and the framed photograph of a trail I had walked in that state park during my 3 days of rest. The only thing I removed was a framed motivational print that Gerald had apparently kept ironically, given that it had been a gift from someone he hadn't liked. I donated it. The first substantive thing I did as owner was meet individually with every member of the operations team. Not to evaluate them. I already knew most of their work better than Derek ever had, but to make sure they knew they were seen. That their contributions were known by the person who now had the authority to act on that knowledge. Patricia Ung, who could have retired 3 years earlier and had stayed out of loyalty to Gerald, agreed to stay on for 18 more months to help manage the transition. She chose her own terms. I accepted them without negotiation because they were reasonable and because she had earned the right to name her conditions. 2 things I did not do. I did not give a speech about justice or redemption, and I did not allow Derek's name to become a defining feature of the story I was building. He had taken up enough room. The first year was the hardest, and it was also the most alive I had ever felt in a professional context. Running a company is not the same as running a department. The scope is different. The loneliness is different. The stakes are different. There were weeks when I worked until midnight and still felt behind. There were decisions I made carefully and got wrong, and I took responsibility for those openly, which turned out to be disorienting for a board accustomed to watching leadership manage perception instead of outcomes. Eleanor Marsh told me at the end of the first quarter that my transparency was refreshing and occasionally alarming. I took that as a mixed compliment and kept doing it. By the end of the first year, 3 significant client contracts that had been stagnating were renegotiated and renewed. I brought in Deborah Chen as a regional lead. She relocated from Cincinnati with a title and compensation that reflected what she actually contributed. The internal culture shifted, slowly and imperfectly and genuinely, towards something that rewarded documented results over self-promotion. I also settled into my life outside the office. I bought a house in a neighborhood I had always liked. I got a dog, a large, thoughtful-looking mutt I named Gerald, partly for his dignified bearing and partly because it made me smile every time I said his name at the dog park. I started hiking on weekends, longer trails than the ones I had walked during my 3 days of rest, and I discovered I had the specific kind of stubbornness that elevation requires. My sister Renee visited in October. We sat on my back porch and she looked at me and said, "You look different, like you stopped apologizing for taking up space." I thought about that for a long time. She was right. As for Derek Paulson, he did not find the new opportunities his resignation letter had promised. The work he had claimed as his own was not there under his name in any verifiable way, and background checks are thorough. He eventually took a regional manager position at a smaller logistics company in a different city, a genuine step down. His professional diminishment was not something I had engineered or desired. It was simply the natural consequence of a foundation that had never been real. The one person I thought about sometimes was Gerald Hargrove. I had been given a company by a man I had admired from a distance and never properly known. What he had done was an act of correction, of conscience. I tried to honor it not by preserving his company as it was, but by building it into something that might actually deserve the name it carried. In the spring of my second year, after the opening of a new regional office, Eleanor Marsh found me and said quietly that Gerald would have found the whole thing satisfying. I thought that was probably true, and I thought that satisfaction, while real, was not the point. The point was the work. It had always been the work. The difference now was simply that the work was mine to give, in my own name, to people who needed it. I didn't win because I was lucky. I won because I kept records when everyone assumed I wouldn't, and stayed quiet when everyone expected me to react. So tell me, what would you have done in that parking lot? Would you have signed or made a list? Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs it. And thank you, genuinely, for listening.